That was hardcore mode, beaten with just 2 towers in a loadout. If you were to go back to 2020 and tell someone at the time that one day the hardest mode ever seen in Tower Defense Simulator would be beatable like this, I could only imagine how they would react. You see, today, solo hardcore is hardly an achievement. Here's a screenshot of me beating it first try just a few days ago. And keep in mind, I'm basically a noob to hardcore mode. I haven't actively played hardcore since way back in 2021, and I even used Necromancer of all things, even though I hardly know how to use the tower either. The point is, today hardcore is just another everyday mode that you beat in your free time as you're grinding gems for engineer or hacker. But today, we're going to go back in time to when hardcore really meant hardcore, when even beating it duo was hardly possible, and how one man would change everything. This is the history of solo hardcore in Tower Defense Simulator. It's August 28, 2020. Tens of thousands of players are crowding around this door, anticipating the biggest update TDS ever promised. And when the big moment comes, nothing. TDS breaks, and the most hyped game mode in history to this very day in 2025 has to get scrapped. But all hope isn't lost. Enter Hardcore Beta. This mode was a true nightmare. For the first time, we had to deal with flying, lead, and ghost enemies. The only maps that hardcore was played on were Robloxia and Highlands. These were extra long maps specifically made for hardcore to make the mode possible. And with the use of golden towers and the strongest available DPS at the time, you were just barely able to beat it in trio. Going down just one player to duo seemed completely impossible. However, there was one saving grace. Mecha Base was accidentally left in the shop by the developers, and it was by far the strongest tower at the time. With the help of Mecha Base, this was possible. One of the first ever duo hardcore runs completed thanks to that tower over there. Trio was already one of the hardest challenges in TDS. Duo was only possible thanks to an accidental admin tower. And solo? That was completely out of the question. Enter the overhaul update. This update finally brought hardcore out of beta. A lot of towers were completely rebalanced, and you might think this would bring hope to the first ever solo hardcore run, and you couldn't be more wrong. 3 things happened that would turn hardcore from a difficult challenge into a nearly unstoppable force. 2 maps were removed, Robloxia and Highlands, and on top of that, so was Mecha Base. The only things that even made duo possible were now gone. Oh, and by the way, the John Tower, which added a 30% damage bonus to all towers in range, was also replaced with Militant. Players had to now play on Wrecked Battlefield, a new map that was added. This map was significantly shorter than the removed Robloxia and Highlands, yet was still a better choice than Nether and Autumn Falling due to the loop at the start. This was all that made the early game possible. Getting an ace pilot would cover the early waves and the flying enemies, and the late game was brutal to say the least. The short length of the map and the insane amount of stunning that came from the Vindicators and Void Reavers would make the second Void Reaver get to the last stretch every single time. It took me 3 days of attempts to even get the first win without golden minigun or accelerator. And with less than 10% of the track length left, beating hardcore duo now either needed the utmost godly RNG or some form of bug to get the Void Reaver stuck. But solo? Don't even think about it. With the release to Frost Invasion came 2 new towers for the first time in months. These were the Sledger and Toxic Gunner. Sledger was insanely strong in the mid game, capable of freezing solid all enemies. Although this was useful, the stun-heavy hardcore mode wouldn't really see Sledger in use. Toxic Gunner, on the other hand, was a beast which TDS has never seen before. Toxic Gunner slowed down every enemy on the screen by 50%, including bosses. This was so overpowered that the first ever solo Badlands triumph was achieved thanks to this tower. At this point, this was by far the most impressive achievement in TDS history, and it left Hardcore and Hidden Wave as the final frontiers of difficulty in TDS. Unfortunately, Hidden Wave was completely out of the question, and would probably warrant a video of its own. Like and comment if you want to see this. But as for Hardcore, when stuff like this was possible in Duo, it seemed like it was only a matter of time before the solo Hardcore triumph would come around. But it never did. There was just too much to deal with. Even with the most overpowered tower in TDS history at the time, solo Hardcore stood undefeated. Enter Solar Eclipse. This was regarded as the best event tower defense simulator has ever had. It came with lore, multiple knights, and the most attractive looking sorry guys, I got a little bit off track there. The strongest boss that TDS has ever seen. For beating the Umbra on night 4, you would be rewarded with the Executioner. The Executioner threw an axe which would deal huge damage to crowds of enemies, but the developers made one small oversight. If you sold the Executioner while the axe was over the track, it would become permanently glitched in that spot. You may not be able to see it, but the enemies can definitely feel it. Repeating this bug enough times would create a point on the map so strong that almost nothing could get past it. And for the first time in history, solo Hardcore has been completed. While now becoming the most difficult challenge ever completed in TDS, it hardly even felt like a win. Using a game-breaking bug to solo Hardcore just doesn't feel rewarding, does it? And after the Executioner bug was patched, for the next 4 months, silence. But on April 22nd, 2022, TDS added the Engineer. Unfortunately, this wouldn't change anything. The Engineer was weak to say the least, and the community was not happy. But even after it was buffed just a week later to give the sentries a shield, for solo Hardcore, this didn't matter. And would go another 7 months before someone would come along who'd change everything. You see, by now, it was November of 2022, over 2 years since Hardcore was first seen in TDS. The easiest map in TDS, Fungi Island, had now become playable on Hardcore mode. On top of that, Engineer had received a small change, just to help it be a little more viable in Hardcore. It now had lead detection at level 0, a seemingly unsuspecting change. Everything else about it had stayed the same, yet there was one player who, seeing these changes, decided to write TDS history. This is Wither, and this is the first ever true solo Hardcore run. And that run is you going down to the description and clicking the first link to go buy my Roblox hat. Look, I know this is a terrible place to put an ad, but I mean, look at this video. It's like the highest quality one I've ever made. So if you want to see more like this, you gotta support the channel in some way, please. Begging you, can't afford to put food on the table. Anyways, join the Discord, become a member, like, subscribe, use Star Cody, whatever. And now, the solo Hardcore run. What you just watched is still to this day likely the most significant achievement ever completed in TDS. He had to play the early game extremely precisely to kill all of the leads and pop all of the balloons. And on wave 50, he needed the perfect mix of micro, speed, and RNG to kill the Void Reaver right at the end. And by completing the hardest challenge in the Roblox tower defense genre by mere frames, one would think, that's it. Time to leave your legacy behind and move on with life. But then TDS removed Fungi Island, leaving a much shorter reworked wrecked battlefield behind. And so, he'd go on to do it again. This was truly pushing TDS to its limits. With the help of a slight loadout change, he was able to win with just a few seconds to spare. Now, I think it's important to mention Wither was no longer the only one soloing hardcore at this point, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to stop. Once TDS released the Jester in November of 2023, much to have Toxic Gunner change the game in 2021, Jester was here to do the same. At this point, Wither had solidified his legacy as the best player in TDS, and it's also when hardcore started to become mainstream. You now started having casual players and YouTubers such as Propellers beating solo hardcore. Don't get me wrong, it was still difficult, requiring a lot of knowledge on how to place your towers and overall understanding of the game mode. But Jester was only the first taste of solo hardcore's downfall. The bug where it got to turn around bosses was patched, briefly bringing solo hardcore back up in difficulty, but it was never really the same anymore. Tower reworks such as the Golden Minigunner would unlock levels of DPS never seen before, but even this wouldn't last forever. Enter 2024. This was easily TDS's most content-packed year. They were constantly releasing updates, and so would come a ton of tower reworks and new towers that would change the way the game was played completely. I even skipped over the Cryomancer, by the way, which was huge for solo hardcore. I had an attempt with it, and keep in mind, I barely had any idea what I was doing, and got to wave 46 first try, where I then died to bad RNG. And from here on, things were only downhill for solo hardcore. The Golden Crook boss rework had made early game more consistent than ever. The addition of Mercenary Base would help out quite a bit. The addition of an extremely unbalanced Gatling gun made it possible to solo hardcore with just 4 tower slots. The rework Pursuit now was a lot stronger, and combined with the buff turret, made it possible NST, kinda, if you count Pursuit as NST. And we all know what happened from there. One word, Swarmer. This thing would stack so much single target damage that if you could handle hordes, it was all you needed to defeat hardcore mode. So players quickly abused the tower to beat hardcore mode with just 3 slots used. And if that wasn't enough, TDS added this. And so, as a result, you could now do this. We've really come a long ways, haven't we? That was the history of solo hardcore. Like, subscribe, use StarCode E before it gets removed, and see ya.